We talk about the deep state, we talk about the globalists.
Inflation versus deflation. Well, I mean,
Here at Mar-a-Lago.
I'm baffled that this isn't front page news.
Do you guys support a specific political party, or do you dislike both of them?
Oh, it worked like a charm on you guys.
Let's go, Brandon.
What's up, everybody? So much crazy stuff happening today, and I'm very excited about this guest. We have Larry Hancock in the house. Larry is a national security researcher and author, often described as a document geek, applying his education and history to the research and collection of the CIA, FBI, State Department, and military documents. He just released a new book called The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald and the History of the CIA Scandals. And the reason I'm very excited to have Larry on today is because there's crazy stuff coming out about the USAID, its role with the CIA, what it's doing with around the world. I mean, they just came out today that was giving money to Politico, a lot of crazy stuff with that. And Larry is very well informed about the deep, dark history of USAID and how it's been acting on behalf of the government. So, Larry, how we doing?
We're doing good tonight. Looking forward to spring.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. So, Larry, first and foremost, so you said you know a good amount about the connections with the CIA and the USAID. I'm sure a lot of people have never even heard the term USAID before a few days ago, but now it's coming out, like now that we're cracking open the books and getting a look at it, that it's really had a big part in a lot of the stuff that the government wanted to do, but wasn't necessarily legally allowed to do. So can you give us a little bit of a breakdown of I guess how this thing got started, what it evolved into, and like the depth of how entrenched it is and the way that things work around the world?
Sure. There are really two looks at USAID. One, it was started by JFK, and you got to go back in history to the Kennedy era. Obviously, at that point in time, we were at the height of the Cold War, a lot of competition with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was actually spending money overseas, a lot of money going into Latin American revolutions, a lot of money going into Africa. JFK, knew there was a competition. Most of the aid up at that point in time had literally been military aid from the U.S. And he wanted, like Eisenhower, wanted to separate space military from space commercial, private, created NASA to make a, public space agency. Kennedy created USAID to do humanitarian relief, food relief, medical, that sort of thing, overseas, strictly overseas, and separate it from military aid. And that was the whole genesis of it. Now, it's gone through several iterations, but the concept is always that it's supposed to be primarily humanitarian, whether it's global food relief, relief after disasters, medical aid, responses to epidemics, that sort of thing. That's the reason it's supposed to be there. And it was created logistics primarily. How do you get that stuff overseas and do it in a very public fashion? The downside is nothing ever stays entirely clean. And,
Yeah.
if you're creating these international channels, what else is going to happen with it? And so pretty quickly, as the CIA became involved with international activities, aid's doing it, they have people working overseas, it becomes a perfect cover for CIA employees moving overseas. What kind of credentials can you have? You can work for a private company or a corporation. You can work for the State Department. State Department was constantly a cover for the CIA, but you can't have our CIA credentials. You got to have, you got to have address, you got to have credentials. So from the very beginning, aid served as a very convenient cover for CIA officers operating overseas, not doing covert operation, but running offices and doing logistics within aid, within aid covers. And that's continued, over time. It shifts with different administrations' priorities, but the CIA, and one of the bad things about that is you can't fool people for too long. So, internationally, everybody realized before long the CIA was doing business under CIA cover, just like State Department cover. You had CIA employees carrying state credentials. So both the State Department, embassies, and aid missions became political targets overseas, in countries that were suspecting American intervention or influence. So, that just, it became tainted, I guess, is really the answer to your question. It became tainted. And that's when you saw revolutions occur, embassies get sacked, aid employees get arrested and imprisoned because it had been contaminated by that CIA connection.
Right, right. I'm almost at the point where I'm wondering if like any of the revolutions that we've seen have been legitimate organic uprisings, or if they've all had a strong, heavy hand of the CIA influence. Because you look back at the 2014 Ukraine uprising with Poroshenko. You look back at all the Ukraine color revolutions. You look at the Arab Springs. You look at the what else you got? Maybe even some Soviet Union stuff, or even when Putin was out of office, a lot of NGOs were trying to. They're paying people in Russia to try to surround the Kremlin and protest. So is it just 100% of the time there's U.S. involvement against regimes they don't like that are trying to create uprisings?
Well, historically, I think you could definitely say that was true. I mean, if you go back to the Eisenhower administration, Kennedy administration, through the 70s, for sure, most of the you had two types of revolutions. You had communist revolutions that were inspired, obviously, by the Soviet Union. You had democratic revolutions, which were basically, let's talk about regime change, because what you're really talking is somebody wanting regime change, swing to your side or the other guy's side. And so we've got a long list. We know pretty much all about that now through the 70s and into the 80s. I think one of the things that you're talking about, and we talked about a little bit earlier, around the turn of the century, there was when these color revolutions, actually, the color revolutions started happening largely on their own, quite frankly, because after the end of the Cold War, most of those folks were fed up with Soviet Union and Soviet bureaucracy and heavy-handedness, everything controlled out of Moscow. And it's just kind of like the general, no, I didn't like that. I'm done with that. I want to be independent, one way or the other. So you had a lot of the Orange Revolution and Georgia and a lot of those things going on. But the Bush administration picked up on that. And really, there was a huge political movement inside the U.S. At that point in time to spread democracy. This is an opportunity for our side. The Soviets had their time. We won the Cold War. It's our turn. We want to spread democracy. And so there was a lot of money allocated by Congress and under the Bush administration to promote democratic actions. Simple things like poll watching, cleaning up elections, communications, and some of that got shuttled directly to NGOs. Absolutely. There's no doubt about that. In Ukraine, you absolutely had money coming in from Russia and you had money coming in from the US. And it's a fight. It's a dog fight, right? Okay. So, how do you parse that out? I did a book called Creating Chaos that actually looked at how much money was coming from where in Ukraine and Georgia, and like, okay, here's what's happening. And the chaos is because you did have, foreign interest, if you will, fighting it out for who's going to have the most influence among these emerging democracies, if you will.
Now, has there ever been a time where that's worked out effectively or the way they intended? Because I can think of a lot of examples where they tried to do that and it went pretty badly and it ended up being worse than when it started. Can you think of any examples off the top of your head where it went well?
Yeah, I wrote another book called In Denial, which the whole point is, can you do this sort of stuff deniably and will anybody catch on and does it work? And the answer is no, you can't. People are smart. Perfect question. And I kept in the book, it's sort of like, why do you keep doing it when it never really works? Why aren't we supposed to learn? But there's this temptation to do it deniably with politics rather than to fight it out. And you can kind of go in, we realize we're in a conflict. There are cultural conflicts, there are political conflicts, and there's always the temptation to think that you can kind of do it cheap and dirty in terms of, maybe not cheap, okay, but dirty in terms of loss of life by doing it covertly, deniably, and it just like it wins over and over again. So, but the answer to your question is basically no, you can't get away with it. Everybody always figures it out.
Yeah, and I mean, I ask cynically because I mean the circumstances kind of pushed me there over here. Like, I started off, I went to school for national security thinking I wanted to work for the CIA. Then once I started learning what the CIA did, I'm like, oh wow, they are actually causing a lot of the problems that I think are problems with the world. So let me just get into media. But like when they plan these things out, like do you think their intentions are good and genuine, or do you think they're trying to create chaos so that we have a reason to oh, need to spend some military money here? Because it seems like there's a big fear of peace in the world because the military industrial complex ends up shriveling up and dying. Like, they had all kinds of problems after the Soviet Union collapsed. So they start advocating for NATO spending. Like I think one of the presidents of Lockheed Martin was like leading the committee to expand NATO. Right. So is, when they do these things, do you think they're trying to create chaos? Like I think of back to the scenario in Syria where I think there's a lot of NGO involvement there where we just overthrew this guy Assad. Like I don't think he was a good guy, but I think that's a more chaotic situation now that you have a former ISIS leader running the country instead of a hostile dictator.
I think that I think it's always competition. I come out of training in anthropology and cultural anthropology, and it's kind of gets to be tribal. You think of that on small scale, but even when you ramp it up to administrations, because your question really goes back to who's setting administration policy, because the CIA really, I mean, if Eisenhower, and by the way, or Eisenhower actually issued an order to kill a foreign president, okay,
Which one?
actually in Congo,
Oh wow.
yeah, and sometimes they do it very openly, but Eisenhower also approved a project which would have resulted in the assassination of Fidel Castro. Okay, regime change. It's always a matter of changing somebody else's regime to be in line with us. Does China want to do that? Absolutely. Do we want to do that? Absolutely. Does Russia? It's like an international competition. So it depends on how a given administration wants to play it. But the orders do come from the top, and the directive, like that democracy directive that I was talking about, that came from the top. It didn't come from when the administration sets the policy. And even Eisenhower was worried about whether or not the future administrations could be influenced by the military-industrial complex. And yes, they could. And concurrent administrations be influenced by other complexes, and even more of them now. Is there a pharmaceutical complex? Is there an agricultural complex? Yeah. So that's real life. But within the agencies, generally these people do their jobs. They're tasked with projects, whether it's regime change or influence but one thing that you ask that you've always got to split up is there are different worlds that they live in. Intelligence collection is one thing. And you need, and nobody can ever go without collecting intelligence, because that is national security. As you've got to have intelligence. Then you've got to have the analyst, where things start crossing the line. Then you have propaganda, and which kind of goes up and down with what the administration wants. But then it gets to these special operations people who really do things like on the ground, like regime change and overthrowing regimes and paramilitary operations. So when you're discussing it, it's sort of like, when does an administration turn from just talking, like the State Department, okay, we're just talking, to, okay, let's bring in the special operators. We need a deniable program. It sometimes, in all honesty, I'm not saying I like it, but in comparing what Russia has traditionally done to what US has done, Russia just stands up and says, I'm going to take over something. The US generally says, oh, I'm not a bad guy, and tries to do it deniably, right? It's like, okay, neither one of them necessarily works long term, but one is a lot cheaper than the other. Normally is a lot cheaper than the other. Because to do it deniably, you've got to make it look like it's somebody else, which doubles the expense.
Win the moral high ground so that you get more, I guess, worldly support, like you're looking like the good guy. So it came out today that the Trump administration is offering so CIA offers to buy out entire workforce as part of Trump makeover. Did you hear about that?
I did hear about that, but I haven't seen enough detail. The entire workforce, I guess, I'll be honest. Am I going to really get rid of a guy that's 20 years doing analytics on intelligence and replace him not at all, or with who? I mean, part of the workforce, I have to say, until I see some more details, I would like to see the plan. Let's put it that way, because I mean, I've been in corporate America, or was in corporate America, and when I saw a new boss come in and say, "Well, I'm going to fire everybody and start all over again," it
Yeah.
never went well. Even if you got, you were one of the 5 guys that got left.
Right. Well, I guess part of the question is like, how deep does the rot go? Because I totally agree with what you're saying. We need an intelligence apparatus. We need to be the best at knowing what's going on around the world. But it seems like the CIA has become this like kind of monster that got away from us. Where even like sometimes the director of the CIA doesn't know everything that's going on, and then the president doesn't know what's going on, and you have like these lifelong careerists there who kind of know all the secrets. I mean, how do we kind of get a handle on that?
I would say that the areas that I've always been most concerned about are like psychological operations and
Mm,
propaganda.
like Operation Mockingbird.
Yeah, that does it work? Sometimes for a short period of time, not for long. And I don't think it's wrong. I mean, certainly it's wrong to do it domestically. We
Do you
even
think they
got
still
into
do
the
it?
case. I'm sorry, what?
I was gonna say, do you think they still do it? Because that kind of like leads into something else we're gonna talk about.
Yeah, they do it, and sometimes they always. It's kind of like the media. You've got to have sources, right? So you share
Mhm.
information to get sources. Well, the CIA always share. I mean, it gets embarrassing. Sometimes I wrote about a couple of occasions where a CIA media source wrote about a revolution before it happened. That's embarrassing. Okay, wait a minute. No, no, the head, no, people are going to think we did that. Well, yeah, we did.
Yeah.
But so there are areas like that where you're trying to manipulate things through the media, through propaganda, whether it's domestically or internationally. I think you can even look at it and say what works and what doesn't work, and stop doing that sort of thing. So,
Right.
but as far as the rot goes, I tend to think it's more in that side of the house. It's not in the collections. It's not the analyst. It's not the reporting. Intelligence intelligence analysis requires a lot of work and requires a lot of data. There's not much room for. I mean, and you offer your opinion, and people either take your opinion or don't take your opinion or your assessment. I think it's over on the other side. It's on the covert side, especially in psychological operations. Uh, and quite frankly, these days, if you have to do a covert deniable military operation, we have people to do that. Now,
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
interesting, yeah, they're there. They're Delta Force. They're whatever. Use them if you need them.
But I think we also have, we'll have like private military companies that'll do things that aren't exactly legal for even the Delta Force to do. And then I think it seems like a lot of these NGOs were doing the same thing where they act on behalf of the government to do things that are outside the legal parameters of what the government can do. Uh, so I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but this story right here, or this situation that Obama did, always fascinate me. So right here we have an article from AP saying the headline says Obama did not sign a law allowing propaganda in the US, but on the fact side of it says the facts. Post circulating on Facebook with the photo of Obama falsely states he repealed a ban on government propaganda in the US when he signed the National Defense Authorization Act in 2013. The amendment did not repeal the Smith-Mond Act, but rather lifted some restrictions on the domestic dissemination of government-funded media. So, then today when you hear what it was found that Politico did, then it, like, because I know, like, we have NPR, we have these groups that we know the government gives the money. Okay, fine, we're all on board. We know that, but then they come out today with this.
On coming out here to the briefing room, I was made aware of the funding from USAID to media outlets, including Politico, who I know has a seat in this room. And I can confirm that the more than $8 million taxpayer dollars that have gone to essentially subsidizing subscriptions to Politico on the American taxpayers' dime will no longer be happening. The DOGE team is working on canceling those payments now. Again, this is a whole of government effort to ensure that We are going line by line when it comes to the federal government's books. And this president and his team are making decisions across the board on, do these receipts serve the interests of the American people?
So yeah, it's found today when they're looking through the books that this USAID thing has been given $8 million a year to Politico, and then they find out that the Politico Pro subscription costs between $25,000 and $75,000 a year, and the Biden administration was paying $26 million a year for the Politico Pro. So I mean, that seems like the government giving money to a media company to make them say certain things.
Yeah, and not that the strange thing about that, I guess what strikes me, the strange thing about it's not, as we were just talking, it's not that there was not media influence before, but
Yeah.
it was usually a quid pro quo thing. I'll provide you some information and you be cautious about what you're saying. It's
Right.
But nobody was paying for anything.
Right.
This is really strange. And domestically, now an interesting thing is there have been times, like with this democracy initiative that I was talking about, that sort of thing happened overseas.
Right.
And it was legally approved, but that's a different story. Or normally what she's just talking about, and I'm normally a big fan of these, IGs should catch that sort of thing. Inspector generals are there to literally go line by line and make sure the money that Congress appropriated is being used the way it was supposed to.
Right.
One of the problems that we've had in the past is continually IGs have submitted reports within their agency that said things should change, things should have. One of the biggest, you go back to Iraq. I mean, there's never been more money wasted and reported on by IGs and with no consequences than Iraq. Although I suppose it's possible, but that's what IGs are for, to do
Right.
that internally within an organization. You shouldn't have to have a separate group. The IGs, and you have to listen to them. When they say it's being misused, you have to listen to them. I have to admit, I don't know that USAID had an IG.
Well, I'm hearing stuff now that the Congress had a really difficult time even getting their hands on the books for them, and that they would, often kind of like act like it was classified money or classified details to even look at their stuff.
That's one of the, obviously being a documents geek, I'm a big fan of transparency, right?
Yeah.
And not overclassification. And we got to say that national security has been used to conceal a number of sins.
Right.
The big thing is, here's USAID supposedly working overseas. What is it doing? What is it doing that would be classified?
Right.
What would it be doing off the books? Did the CIA, did somebody else? Why should there even be anything classified at all? So that's a big question to me. I don't disagree with that at all. I can't. That money should be as easily tracked as in a public corporation. You should have an accounting company. That's another question. Obviously, normally agencies have accounting departments that are very rigorous about that sort of thing. So if USAID wasn't doing that, it's not like, I'll have to say CIA, the military services, NSA have been my personal focus. So I'm not in any position to give you in-depth details of things within USAID. I just know how they've generally operated. But that needs to be fixed.
Yeah, and we're seeing stuff like this come out where like terrorist groups are in tents that have USAID logos on them. I mean, and you see the list of the was it like millions of dollars of condoms that went to Gaza and all this crazy stuff. So it's like it feels like a big giant money laundering thing right now, because like there's no oversight on it. It's like who's getting kickbacks on these things. Like it,
Here's
and the fact that everybody's freaking out so much, it's like they've hit a major nerve by going after this. Because like you see what they're doing in DC right now, like they Democrat Congress people and like, saying like we need to fight right now. We need to like they want to impeach Trump over this. They're talking about impeaching Trump. They're telling millions of people to come down to DC and protest. They're trying to go inside the buildings. Like it's like they're really upset about this for some reason. We're just asking like what the money's being used for.
Yeah, well, first of all, I am a big fan of separation of powers. Okay, so we can get,
Yeah.
but that's a separate argument. I guess the kicker is if you're just looking at the books, as it were, and you have authority to look at the books, and everybody's, okay, that's fine. I I wanted, but not necessarily in USAID's defense, but one of the problems has always existed for both the CIA on the covert side and USAID on the overt side is the logistics of delivering stuff. Because you kind of think that people that are getting the stuff, um, they want the stuff. Yeah. Do they want food? Do they want medicine? Do they want tents? Do they want, sure they want it, but there's always somebody on their side who's in between. So if I'm USAID and I manage to deliver it to somebody who promises to give it to the right people, do I know that tent? And by the way, who has the guns? And we've seen that in Gaza. I can
Yep.
give out all I want, but the guys that have the guns tend to collect it so they can dispense it. So
Yeah.
I will have to say, the devil's always in the details. So you can do good things and have bad results. An example of this, I think, back during the Afghanistan and those conflicts, when the Russians were in Afghanistan, we sent a lot of money to Pakistan.
Right.
Sent a lot of money to Pakistan to go to revolutionary action against the Russians. Where did that money end up going? Well, the intention was to equip people to kill the Russians. Okay.
Mujahideen.
The Mujahideen, right. Instead, the people that got to it first were the people that started ISIS. And,
Yeah.
it's like, you know, that's one of the problems with trying to do this deniably. If you try to finesse things, you always get had. So I'll reserve my, yeah, I know things would have gone wrong and probably, no good deed goes unpunished. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. Do you think this is the kind of just the tip of the iceberg of the things that we're going to find out? Because I mean, it seems like we've just turned our head the other way with a lot of the stuff for a long time. And I mean, I'm a big fan of what they're doing with the DOGE because, like, they're trying to scare people, saying, "Oh, they're looking at your social security stuff. That they got access to the Medicare, Medicaid stuff today," which I'm excited about that because that's like I think that's the biggest, potentially most corrupt pile of money in the world. It's like 1.6 trillion of money that just kind of gets doled out. So I don't know. I'm a big fan of that. What do you think of that stuff?
Yeah, here's what I really think. Obviously, as I said before, I've always been a big fan of IGs and a big fan of oversight and a big fan of accounting. Okay.
Yeah.
That should have been happening all the time. We also know about graft and corruption, and it wasn't. So if you can make it happen with a third party who's squeaky clean,
Yeah.
that's good. But people need to be able to trust the third party. This is where the separation of powers. They need to be before you do something like that. It's like I've been with accounting firms. It's like, okay, the accounting firm walks in the building and everybody panics. It's kind of like the bank auditors walk into the building. I used to be a banking consultant, and we walk into the banking, not on auditing, on some other things. We'd walk in the building in briefcases, and everybody would hide under their desk because they thought we were the auditors, So, but if you get up front, and I guess my critique at this point in time is that story needed to be told really well at the very beginning. Like, here is why they're here. Here's their limits. Here's all they're doing. They're auditors. They're not giving any orders. They're just looking at data. I think maybe personally, I think that was the problem from the get-go that scared people, because you do scare even people. The people that were hiding under their desk in the banks weren't necessarily doing anything wrong, but they don't know what's going to happen to them. So scaring people's not a good thing. That's my only comment.
I gotcha. That makes sense. So now with Trump declassifying the JFK, MLK, and RFK stuff, you're an expert on this. What do you think we can expect from that? Like, I think a lot of people feel they have a good idea of what happened to RFK. Do you think we're going to be shocked by anything? Do you think that there's anything that people are overlooking?
yeah, having written books and worked all three of those cases, obviously I'm a document geek on all of them. So, but one interesting thing is they're different. I mean, in JFK, there was a federal investigation. There are federal records. We know where to get them.
Yeah.
MLK, it wasn't that simple. And with RFK, it's not at all.
Mm.
But an interesting thing, for example, before I answer your question,
Yeah.
with RFK, one of the things we learned down the road after the decades was that James Angleton, the director of the CIA's counterintelligence group, had a compartmentalized file that was hundreds of feet long of documents, not part of the central, not under anybody's oversight. We learned that there were RFK assassination documents in there. And the question
Wow.
you ask yourself is, why?
Yeah.
Angleton had a lot of relationships with overseas governments, did a lot of things on his own. What did he have? I would love to find out. And what we did find out was that they spent 3 years going through all his documents, figuring out which ones they would put in the CIA headquarters files and which ones they were just going to destroy. It's like,
Wow.
if I could just find out which one they destroyed, I would learn something. But
Yeah.
people have invested a lot of time. So back to your real question. With the JFK stuff, we need stuff to really answer the questions that the CIA has not yet even given to the National Archives. So it's not just a matter of declassification and removing all the redactions, because if they give us all these documents and they're still blacked out, like,
Oh.
okay, president's team has got to include that. You just can't give us the documents. You got to unredact them. But we
Right.
also need documents that the CIA has been fighting to withhold, and they haven't given an R. So it needs to be a broader collection than that. There are even critical things like Jackie Kennedy's interviews with William Manchester. We know both
Mm.
Jackie and Robert thought that there was a domestic conspiracy. They never said that publicly, but we now know that they thought that. And there are interviews that have been classified and are going to remain classified for another 50 years if somebody
Really?
doesn't do something now. Yeah.
Wow.
They should have been collected into evidence, long story short. But so the good news is we've got the list. We're actually given the list to the working group. And if we can get that sort of thing, I think what we could really answer, because we got to be realistic. We know, for example, that the CIA actually, even though they didn't tell the Warren Commission this, they actually ran an internal investigation to see if any of their paramilitary officers, their special officers, and their Cuban exile surrogates that they're working with had been
Mm.
involved. We know they do that. We even saw
Yeah.
the questions that were asked. The report was supposed to be prepared. The report's gone. Would that be a smoking gun if I could see it? Yeah, probably so, but I don't think I'm going to see it. What I could see is there are things we know about that could reveal what they knew about Lee Harvey Oswald, what they may have been doing manipulating Oswald, around Oswald, especially in psychological propaganda operations.
And he
Uh,
had government pay stubs too, right?
no, that actually is his tax stuff has been released, and
Uh-huh.
other than a fact of about a 3-month period, it was all released to his wife some time ago, and it's been available. But those 3 months, well, I will just say this: I was in the service for 4 years, never
Mm.
made enough money in those 4 years to pay taxes. So it's like, I don't know. Oswald just didn't make enough money. Anyway, long story short, but the good news there is we do know what to look for, and I think there would be that we would learn some things about what should have been investigated. I don't know if we can recover that, 60 plus years later, but at least we could clear up a lot of the mysteries if we get what we know is there. The same is true for MLK. And the same may be true for RFK, although that's going to be more difficult to do because it was LAPD and the LA District Attorney. A lot of things we don't know about what the LA District Attorney ordered
Mm.
LAPD to do an area.
Mm.
But anyway, so a long-winded answer to your question. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff we can learn but it just can't be give us what you've got and what's in the collection and unredact that. No, we need other stuff.
All right. So for JFK, what's your top theory for motive, and then your top theory for like who did it, or even give like a top three? Because I mean, he really pissed everybody off. Like they double crossed the mafia. He was trying to shut down the Federal Reserve and give their power to the Treasury. There's the stuff with Israel where he was trying to inspect their nuclear capabilities. What else? There's the stuff with Lyndon Baines Johnson. There's the stuff with the CIA where he said he wanted to smash 2,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. So there's an infinite supply of powerful enemies that he was creating. So was it all
There's
them?
even one scenario that goes back to the relatives of the guys who died on the Thresher submarine. If you started out with motive for the JFK investigation, you're never going to be done. I mean, there are just too many people that disagreed with what he was trying to do. Too many motives. And I've been at this for 35 years and spent probably 20 of them with all the ones that really didn't work out. So basically, I wrote a book called Tipping Point as to answer that specific question. What pushed somebody over the edge to actually do it? Because everybody can be dissatisfied with an administration, and usually are, right? Okay, so but by 1963, there were a lot of people that had national security concerns because JFK, as a pragmatist, didn't think you had to go to war with everybody, was very much concerned about nuclear exchange. He is pursuing neutrality in Laos, and that was kind of working. He was actually going to be pursuing neutrality in Vietnam, and that might have worked. And Fidel Castro had approached him covertly and said he was willing to talk about kicking the Russians out, going neutral, economic problems, but we need to reach some kind of compromise. And Kennedy had basically said, if you just stop encouraging revolutions in Central America, we can talk. Let's just talk about Cuba, okay?
Yeah.
That had gone on. There were lots of strong opposition to that, and people that sincerely thought, this was treasonous because you're moving people. We've got to fight communism to the death. So when people within the CIA passed this word down to Miami, they're stationed there, who had been fighting against Castro for 3 years, using Cubans. All these people had built their lives around regime change, and the Cubans wanted a democratic regime. And what happens if the U.S. stops supporting us? And basically, they were given a message that if this negotiation goes through, you guys aren't going home, because the Castro regime will be there forever, which it was, but that's another story. Anyway, it's kind of like in Tipping Point, I kind of go through that whole process down to the level of the individuals who were so emotionally. These are guys who had been through the Bay of Pigs. They had been through the missile. This is personal, this kind of thing. Assassinations can get really personal. To the guys up on top, it may be strategic and national security and all this or that. To the guys that are going to go in to do the combat, it's got to be personal. And it was personal. And they considered it an act of patriotism, I would say. So
question on that. So, I mean, call me crazy, but my hypothesis is that after World War II, we kind of build up this big military industrial complex monster. Even Eisenhower warned about it after. So this thing doesn't exist before the war. It exists after the war, and it's, either lives or dies if there's a war, if there's somebody to fight. Right. So a lot of people, even General Patton, was arguing hey, why are we stopping at Germany? We should go get Russia while it's weak. Let's go. Let's take them out. We can take them out right now. For some reason, they don't do that. Patton dies in a little bit of a mysterious way, and we let things kind of, simmer down, and we let Russia consolidate, and we have this 50-year Cold War situation where we throw a ton of money at it, ton of resources at it. A part of me wonders if we let Russia regather and kind of overhyped how much of a threat they were in order to justify this crazy amount of spending, because you need a serious threat. You need a boogeyman to have a lot of spending. Even when the Soviet Union collapsed, what do? We immediately tried to expand NATO, and a lot of people would argue that ended up provoking Russia. So where are you in terms of they thought that Russia was an actual threat. They were legitimately trying to fight communism versus they just needed a boogeyman to throw money at.
I would say in 1947. So from 1945 and before, when the national security legislation was all passed, when the CIA was formed, when the military services were split, we had had a very bad experience with Russia at the end of the war. Everything Stalin said that he was going to do, he did not. Every time we tried to do jointly military, I mean, they arrested our pilots. They said, yeah, you can fly missions against Germany or Japan, and you can. They arrested the pilots, kept them in prison, and held the aircraft.
Wow.
They basically went back on every promise they had made. Plus, Stalin was very overtly. It's kind of like Western Europe is our sphere of influence, and communist revolutions. Basically, I would say Stalin scared everybody to death. And when you look at the people that actually they're writing that's behind the national security legislation, they were convinced that they were in a war of survival. You know, this isn't just political. It's not just spheres of influence. The communists are going to come for us. You know, that they've said they're going to come for us, and they have the biggest army in the world at the moment, which they did. And they could have literally, you know, what's stopping them from rolling all the way and taking Britain, which they were talking about doing.
Right.
So people were scared. I mean, at that point in time, it was literally scared. So the answer to your question is, I think this all started in just absolute fear, but it wasn't just one side. It wasn't just fear. The other side was saying, we're going to do that. And if you look at the Communist Manifesto, it was pretty, when Khrushchev says, we will bury you, what are you going to think? You know, he's going to bury us. You know, now, maybe he was talking about economically, but that's not your immediate reaction, right? That's not what he said. He didn't say we're going to outproduce you with our 5-year plan. He said we're going to bury you. So, did the military industrial complex take advantage of that? Sure, they did. There's absolutely, but with that kind of very basic fear in play, and so you've got that fear. And the other thing that you've got is an opportunity for the American economic system. I'm sure you've heard, even if your age is, if it's good for Chevrolet, it's good for America. You know, one of those things. It's like, okay, we really have an advantage here after the war. We're best for the whole world to expand and like run their businesses, and we'll all be good. And you know, so it was twofold: fear plus opportunity, I would say. Now, if you project that forward in time, again, in that book, I talked about creating chaos. If you look at what Putin started to say, Putin, for a time, was a good guy. He was talking about cooperation. Believe it or not, Russia even joined NATO. People do not necessarily know that, but Russia actually joined NATO.
Yeah.
There were
They want to.
exercises against terrorism. And then he got into this gas warfare thing, cut off the gas to Western Europe in December, January, which scares people, and started making some pretty radical statements about a sphere of influence. Now, was he threatened? Obviously, he threatened. But, you know, it's never one-sided. Somebody scares somebody else, they push back, and it gives the people who are making things and looking for advantage an entree. So again, a long-winded answer. I don't think it's ever simple, but if people keep scaring each other, it's always going to go on that way. And it doesn't seem like it's west or east. They're always like, as soon as they get scared, the pushback makes it worse.
Okay, I gotcha. So earlier you said, before we started the show, you said that George H.W. Bush was one of your favorite presidents, and I've I've heard a lot of things that are weird about what he was doing around the time that JFK got killed. Like he made a phone call to like establish an alibi, and you know he was obviously one of the, I guess, early founding fathers of like the cowboy era of the CIA, where they were really running rogue and doing some crazy things. So, how do you kind of weigh those two things of like his policies as a president and the CIA stuff?
I mean, basically what I liked about him was his approach to, for example, conservatism with some heart to it. Yeah, you don't want to beat everybody down. You want to bring people up if possible. You want to do things the right way. He was, his attitude towards promoting democracy. I'm a big fan of democracy, and the thought of promoting it overseas struck me right. So that it was more a cultural attitude thing, the way he was conducting the presidency, basically, and his objectives. Now back to the CIA. Okay, that's obviously that's a different story entirely. What we do know for sure, and this is from the documents, and I've read them myself, and I've found them. George got started, in the oil business, and one of the things that we know is if you go back to the 50s and 60s, the CIA. This is a period of time, and I was living then. It was very patriotic to work with the CIA. I know people don't necessarily feel that way, but if you were an American businessman and the CIA asked you for information, or can I send some of my guys on one of your ships? Would you give them employment? Cooperation was good. In fact, it was so good that it got excessive. I've documented and written about cases where, the CIA director of the Western Hemisphere would call a dozen major industrialists, whether they're in ag or shipping or whatever, and give them a pre-revolutionary briefing, like there is going to be a revolution in Guatemala. What you guys might want to prepare for that. Quid pro quo. Oh, you guys helped us. You help us carry some things in that help the revolutionaries. There are revolutionaries, so they're good guys. They're not their revolutionaries who are bad guys. So it was not uncommon to find businessmen, especially businessmen doing international stuff, in contact with the CIA. And George was doing that. And George developed, because he was in the oil business, a lot in the Caribbean, just like some of the other industrialists, especially that were working in the Caribbean and Latin America, developed a close relationship. And they used his companies. We were talking about using aid for cover. They used these oil companies for covers too. They used United Fruit for covers. So he was looked upon as a good guy, which is, I think, this is a guy we can trust. If somebody asks us if we have a vote for who should be director, he's got our vote. But what I will say is my view of this is that we have got the documents that show that he was supportive all the way back to the early 60s, because we can say he was identified as a CIA asset, not an employee, not anything, but it's like, we'll meet with him, and not only will he help us, but we're going to give him information. We're going to introduce him to the right people who are doing business where he wants to do business, whether it's a local dictator or, but there are guys. And obviously George knew how to leverage that. So I guess we've got to be real world about that sort of thing. Did he have a connection to the CIA that made them comfortable enough to even have him as a director? Yeah, but it could have been other there. I can give you a name of a dozen other high level businessman industrialists who could have been the same way. In fact, I would suggest that almost everyone that was nominated for that position had that kind of background.
Interesting. So when did it really get out of control, do you think? I mean, I get that all things start as a noble cause, and then they tend to get out of control because they have power and the ability to have secrecy. Like when did it really start getting crazy? Because it seems like they started to try.
Yeah, the deniability is where it starts getting crazy. I mean, originally when Eisenhower would do things on global scale, and Eisenhower's not a bad guy, even though he is fighting world communism. But what we know now, again, is what he would do is he would go to the State Department, okay? And he'd go to the State Department and say, we need to resolve this thing in Vietnam. Can you do a deal? Can we do a compromise? Talk with the Chinese, talk with whoever. Can we resolve this diplomatically? And okay. But then he would turn around and if it couldn't be resolved diplomatically, and I guess maybe it's because he still wants to look like a good guy, he takes it to the CIA, who's headed by the head of the State Department's brother right? Okay, it's like if you can't do it, get him to do it. And Eisenhower actually starts going rogue at that point, maybe because it was a former military commander. But I will tell you, even right before the disaster at the Bay of Pigs, I have documents showing Eisenhower calls the CIA guy who's in charge of it in and says, look, I need to use the military. I need to invade Cuba. I need just to take out the Castro regime. So I want you to run a false flag operation. I want you to stage something like it looks like they attacked Guantanamo, they did this, they did that, and then I can use the military.
This
I
is
think that's
Northwoods.
yeah. Well, that's Northwoods. Actually, Northwoods was even after that.
Oh wow.
This was before Northwoods.
Okay.
Northwoods actually came about after the Bay of Pigs failure. But
Mm.
it's always this. You ask where it really goes bad, and it really goes bad when there's this desire not to say something straight out. It's kind of like Fidel. You're talking to the Russians. If we're having problems with communist regime, and but do not take military. We got to have some kind of a compromise. You can't be taking weapons from the Russians and doing all these revolutions in Central America. We're not going to tolerate it.
Right.
So let's be straight about that. And if it happens, you know what's going to come. When you try to go deniable, it all goes bad.
I see. So I got a crazy one for you here. So tell me if you've ever heard of this before. I I came across this a while ago. There's apparently a bizarre connection between John Hinckley Jr. and the Bush family. Have you ever heard of this?
Oh yes, yes, yeah. Well,
So
after
you know
35
this.
years, it's hard to believe I haven't heard of anything strange and weird.
So
And there
first,
is, but I'll give you a compromise. Again,
mm,
I
but
there's these 6 degrees of separation in sociology where you can connect almost anybody to anybody else. You could
mhm,
before social networking. Now it's like even worse. Like Lee Harvey Oswald's best friend in Dallas, Texas, was a fellow named George de Mohrenschildt, who was a
okay,
cousin to Jackie Kennedy.
mm,
I view this in much the same way. There's a connection there. Can I make something out of it? I've never been able to make anything out of it. I know people that feel that they can for themselves, but no, now I'll have to say the Bush family the Bush family was really good. What they were doing was making money.
yeah,
And they like I have a friend who in the JFK research community who he and I have these frequent arguments. He's going, well, George Bush was in Dealey Plaza at the time of the Kennedy assassination, and I'm going, look, George Bush at that time was barely out of his teen years. He had no experience in anything. Why would anybody who's seriously assassinating the president want George Bush in Dealey Plaza, trust him in Dealey Plaza? If you can lay out a scenario that really convinces me of that, I'll go with it. And I'm the same way with the Hinckley thing. That
yeah.
did, I haven't seen the dots connected enough to be satisfied, but I've been seen people trying to connect them.
Well, yeah, this article says that pretty much Hinckley's brother was at Neil Bush's house like for dinner the day that Reagan got shot by Hinckley. So I don't know, you don't think there's anything there?
No, I really don't, other than just these people know each other, they're related. Again, one of the arguments that's made about JFK is Allen Dulles was at CIA headquarters the day of the Kennedy assassination.
Hmm. And he had been fired before for the Bay of Pigs invasion, right?
Kennedy but I have to do a sanity test. Like
Mhm.
he's worked there for 30 years. He's the people there know him. He does go back. It wasn't like the only day that he'd ever gone back to CIA headquarters. And by the way, if he was going to be part of this, wouldn't he want a better alibi than that? Like because you know somebody's going to ask why would you even do that. So anyway, I guess when it comes to conspiracy, I'm generally considered as a conservative conspiracy nut.
Mm. So your theory on JFK is that it was a consensus because he was going after like because they didn't see eye to eye with him on how foreign relations should go, like because he was being too much of a peace oriented guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that
Okay.
was at the very top. And I've had some exchanges with people that knew or had family members that were involved in the attack in Dallas.
Yeah.
And basically they even told me after the fact, their relatives realized that those people at the very top who had generated this, who had enabled it, who had instigated it, probably had a different agenda. You know, they were told one thing and they were told what was going to happen after it was done. And they were told that it would result in Cuba being invaded militarily and freed, and it wasn't. And they,
Right.
after the fact, themselves felt that they had been used. And I've seen a lot of this being used stuff.
You know what the Kennedy thing reminds me of a bit, and like just with so many things going wrong, coincidentally, like the stuff where they didn't have the roof on the thing, the guards weren't where they were supposed to be, the windows were open or the windows weren't cleared. Like it reminds me of the Trump thing that happened earlier this summer. Do you think there was some weirdness around that has some overlaps to the Kennedy thing?
I think as much as I'd say it, I think there's a constant theory with the Secret Service from JFK on. The Secret Service, I mean, obviously they got a tough job,
Yeah.
but one of the things that they face, and they faced in the JFK at that particular time, they weren't prepared for that kind of attack. All the attacks on presidents before then had been up close and personal in crowds, and so that's what they were prepared for. Okay, fine. And they did a lot of preparation, studied the records in great detail, but they were also, how can I put it? The White House detail had routinely taken a standard practice of going out and drinking every night. And I will tell you, we know that White House detail had been in a bar until 3 a.m. in the morning.
Yikes.
And we know that they were being served liquor regardless of what they said afterwards. And I have a friend who interviewed the bartender, and that's what it's like. Why do you think they would be here at 3 a.m. drinking Coke? It makes no sense. But so to extend it, the thing is, they always seem to, they're doing so much of what they're doing. They get laissez-faire. It's almost impossible. The lack of coordination that I see in the attack on Donald Trump and that thing is amazing. They weren't doing their job. That's just, I don't, in fact, it is so obvious and so overt, it's hard for me to see it being planned, because that is just like, okay, this just screams stupid. This just screams you're going to lose your job. There's that building. It's right there, and you've got people with scopes looking for it. And, it's almost like bad comedy, but clearly it's a major failure of the Secret Service. We've had that before, though. I mean, I have had ongoing concerns, but it's not just a concern about the Secret Service. It's concerned about presidents. Up to JFK, presidents were used to being able to do politicking up close and personal. That we shake hands, we kiss babies, that sort of thing. We should have learned at that point in time in our society, the way we are now, and Trump was protected at least somewhat by the shield, but you can't be up close and personal. You're also asking these guys to take a risk too. If you expose yourself, you're exposing them. If you expect them to defend you by jumping in front of you and getting shot, well, then that was a big ask. You have some skin in the game too. But again, another long-winded answer. I guess my thing is, no, they made some mistakes that are so overwhelming it has to be more stupid than anything else.
Yeah, I could see that. So last one, let's go with MLK, FBI. What was the motive to take out MLK, and who do you think is the culprit? Was it?
Actually, I'm more comfortable with that than anything else I've done, because we've actually interviewed and have on record one guy who carried the money to pay James Earl Ray to do it. Short answer to this one: the guys that killed MLK had been trying to kill MLK for a good 6 years themselves.
Oh, wow.
So White Knights Klan group out of Georgia, out of Mississippi.
Mm.
They had actually, before, they had tried to do it themselves on multiple occasions, and MLK, just by sheer luck, was the kind of guy who kept changing his plans. I mean, they would set up an ambush. We know of one incident where they set up an ambush to blow up a bridge, shoot him, do everything else, and like an hour before, he goes to a different place. Okay.
Wow.
In another place, they blew up his hotel room, but he had left an hour earlier than he was supposed to. And it just goes on and on. They kept trying and they kept failing. They actually put a contract out on him, brought in
Wow.
a Dixie Mafia shooter from Oklahoma, had him set up to kill him in a rifle attack, and couldn't come up with the cash to pay him, and he backed out.
Wow.
In this particular case, they came up with $100,000 and let a contract within the federal prison system, believe it or not.
Wow.
James Earl Ray had even, we know, he talks about having heard of that contract while he was in prison. He even talked to a guy who was getting out of prison. I mean, Ray broke out later himself, or snuck out, but who was going back to Atlanta, and he told him he should contact these people because it was easy money, because you could sign up for two things: $10,000, and you just come on as a support guy. You carry messages, you carry the rifle, $100,000, and you kill them. Okay.
Yeah.
And we talked to the guy who carried the $100,000, okay, that was to be paid. What happened, and I know this sounds amazing. James Earl Ray, once you get to know James Earl Ray, was all about the money. Okay.
Yeah.
He signed up just to carry that rifle in to kill him. But when he got in the rooming house and he looked out his window and he saw Dr. King sitting on the balcony, it's kind of like, okay, $100,000, here I am. And he takes the shot, he kills King, and then leaves a trail that an elephant could stumble across. I mean, like, he leaves his radio that he had in prison with his prison ID number in the room. Okay.
Oh my God.
It just, so what it really was, it was a racist action. But that it kind of gives us a clue into another thing that we have not talked about, which is the tendency of the establishment to seize the media narrative after these sorts of things. Because that night, Hoover and the Attorney General went on the air and said it was a single shooter, there's no conspiracy, and race wasn't part of it. Now, we were talking about deniability, right?
Yeah.
Does anybody really think race would not have been part of shooting Martin Luther King Jr.? Yeah, that
Right,
was,
of course.
that's just stupid anyway. But they admitted that that was totally manufactured. They were just trying to seize the narrative to minimize the riots that they knew were going to happen. So there are always two stories in this. You know, there's the immediate story that comes out, and then there's the story you only learn 10 years later, 50 years later, whatever. But at least that was a shorter answer to your MLK question.
No, that's great. That's super insightful. So we're at about an hour now. Larry, this is awesome. And thank you so much for doing this. Guys, if you want to get Larry's book, The Oswald Puzzle, Reconsidering Lee Harvey Oswald and the History of CIA Scandals, it's in the description. Larry, any final thoughts?
No, just I will say, if anybody chooses to read it, you will find a Lee Harvey Oswald that you never heard about before, because the Warren Commission didn't tell you about the real one, because since they couldn't find a motive, they needed to make him like antisocial, asocial, a loner, vicious, violent, which they managed to do with the help of the national media, but that was not there. You'll find the real one and the real pictures in the book.
Interesting. All right. So guys, check that out. Larry, thank you so much. Have a great night.
Great to be here. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
You know, we talk about the deep state, we talk about the globalists.
Inflation versus deflation. Well, I mean,
Here at Mar-a-Lago.
I'm baffled that this isn't front page news.
Do you guys support a specific political party, or do you dislike both of them?
Oh, it worked like a charm on you guys.
Let's go, Brandon.